I would like to welcome you to our symposium on improving decision-making across the drug lifecycle in challenging times. This is organized by our team of regulatory science researchers at the KU Leuven Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences. The symposium consists of 4 sessions, and in each session, our Minister for Health and Social Affairs, Frank van den Broeke, will be our virtual key guest. In addition to that, our PhD researchers and external guest speakers will talk about a number of topics. During the session, also please feel free to submit your questions, which we will address at the end of the session. In order to do so, please use the chat box function. Today we have arrived at the 4th session, in which we will look at increasing affordability in healthcare. This topic will be introduced by Teresa Barcina, who in her PhD research focuses on health economic aspects of off-patent biologics and biosimilars, with the support of the KU Leuven Mabel Fund.
The session of today is about increasing affordability in healthcare. We are going to focus on how to address the affordable and sustainable access to medicines, and we are going to discuss important challenges ahead in the context of the Belgium healthcare system. So, decision makers, they are confronted with finding a balance between keeping an acceptable level of pharmaceutical spending and then ensuring access to innovative treatments for the populations in need. And with the arrival of high-cost innovative medicines, pharmaceutical spending has been on the rise, and finding the right balance is becoming increasingly important. So an example of these high-cost innovative therapies is biologics. So biologic medicines, they represent the fastest growing segment of the pharmaceuticals market, and they are being increasingly prescribed because they have a positive impact on clinical outcomes for many patients diagnosed with highly debilitating conditions such as cancer. However, although these therapies, they represent important medical advances, they also represent important costs to be addressed by or covered by healthcare systems. So it is becoming important to find a way to optimize spending in the biologic sectors, and biosimilars, they offer this opportunity. After the expiry of patents and other exclusivity rights for innovative biologics, then biosimilars enter the market. And this is important because these therapies, they are therapeutically equivalent to already marketed biologics. And by entering the market, they offer the opportunity to induce competition within the class of products. And this is eventually resulting in lower prices as well. So in Belgium, for example, the market entry of biosimilars for TNF-alpha inhibitors triggered a mandatory price cut, and this resulted in lower prices or lower expenses associated to the class of TNF-alpha inhibitors at the level of the hospital. So as we consider that it is very important to optimize spending in the biologic sector, we will be presenting Belgium-specific data later in the session of today. Now, another example of high-cost innovative therapies is orphan drugs. Orphan medicines, they have the potential to address unmet medical needs in patients with rare diseases, and this offers an important value. But also these medicines, they often come at a high price. And this is raising some questions about the affordability of these medicines. For example, you may have heard in the news that some orphan gene therapies, they reached list prices of over 2 million per patient. And as I already mentioned, this is raising some questions about affordability. So we believe that it is very important to explain the challenges that healthcare systems face when assessing the affordability of orphan drugs. And that's why we will be presenting a case study about this later today. But already with these 2 examples of high-cost innovative medicines, and considering that there is an increasing trend in costs, and that this trend is expected to continue in the coming years, then cost containment measures are needed. However, these cost containment approaches, they often come with restricting patients' access to innovation or to treatments in general. And as this is not a wanted outcome, then a fundamental question arises. How can we alleviate the already pressured healthcare budgets while still ensuring access to innovation. And the speakers of today's session, they will be addressing this question. So first, the Minister of Health and Social Affairs, Frank van den Broeke, who will elaborate on future policy directions to optimize spending in Belgium. Then my colleague, Yannick Vandenplas, the PhD researcher at KU Leuven, who will present a case study on the off-patent biologic sector in Belgium. And this will be followed by the presentation of Khadidja Abdallah, who is also a PhD researcher at KU Leuven. She will be presenting a case study on the current role of budget impact analysis used for the assessment of the affordability of orphan drugs. And then to conclude the session, Francis Arickx, who is head of the Department of Pharmaceutical Policy at RIZIV INAMI, he will be presenting strategies to support the access to innovation.
With a view to increase affordability in healthcare, we asked Minister Frank van den Broeke about his plans to improve drug spending in Belgium.
Affordability of healthcare and medicines in particular has been a struggle over the last years, will certainly continue to be one. Innovative therapies have a lot of potential, but they are often very expensive. And of course, it is our wish to make good therapies with real added value accessible to everyone as much as possible. And there you have to find a cost that is socially acceptable and in proportion to the therapeutic value of new drugs. We must be aware that expensive therapies need to be recalibrated once the market situation has changed, for instance due to a price drop in a comparable product or the arrival of a new, more valuable product. This is certainly a major challenge in our policy domain during this legislature, and strengthening the expertise supporting the Commission of Reimbursement is, I think, a necessary investment. And we recently were able to make an agreement within the government that there will be a real investment in the expertise surrounding the Commission of Reimbursement at RIZIV. Evidence-based and therefore effective care is a thread running through my policy brief, the coalition agreement, and every decision we want to take. Effective care is important to provide patients with the best possible care, but also to keep healthcare affordable. We are also looking into recommendations in the report that was developed by the task force set up at RIZIV for biosimilars. For some of these recommendations, we need legal changes, and so we are now looking into the possibility to include those legal changes in a bill that will be proposed soon with various provisions on healthcare in it. Another approach that can add to optimization of spending is horizon scanning, which basically means, in my understanding, that you start to prepare as early as possible the kind of choices you have to make on new drugs in the package, priorities and sequence. One valuable approach where horizon scanning can optimize budgetary spending is to use that knowledge to start timely debates on our willingness to pay for innovative treatments, so that authorities can act as buyers of healthcare technology rather than simply having to react as payers. We will conduct these debates with our partners from Benelux and even beyond, so that the results are broadly and internationally supported. In that respect, I am very much looking forward to the first results of the International Horizon Scanning Initiative that we participate in, results which were expected by the end of the year.
Creating a competitive and sustainable market for off-patent biologics and biosimilars is a challenge. Therefore, Yannick Vandenplas, whose PhD is supported by RIZIV INAMI, will present his analysis of the Belgian off-patent biologic and biosimilars market, and will also introduce the concept of best value biologics.
So best value biological medicines in Belgium. A first question that we could ask ourselves is, what are biological medicines in fact? We all know traditionally chemically synthesized molecules, such as, for example, paracetamol or dafalgan. On the other hand side, we also have biological products, like, for example, the AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine, or insulin injections for patients with diabetes. If we would look at more molecular level, biological medicines are first of all much larger, and they're also much more complex. If we would place them next to each other, we would indeed see the difference in size. In order to get biological medicines onto the European market, it is important that they are evaluated and approved by the European Medicines Agency on its quality, safety, and efficacy. Afterwards, in order to get it to the Belgian market, it's important that price and reimbursement have been evaluated, and in Belgium this is being done mainly by our national health insurer, RIZIV INAMI. Biological medicines are important for a lot of patients, especially in the field of oncology, rheumatology, and diabetes. This means that there is quite a large patient population in Belgium, which creates, of course, a high cost for our national health insurance system. And also because of the fact that biological medicines are more complex and more costly to produce, which creates simply a higher price of these products. This is a trend that we see reflected during past years in our data on pharmaceutical expenses in Belgium, or the budget on pharmaceutical specialties in Belgium. Between 2015 and 2019, we've seen a steep but steady increase during past years. When looking specifically at last year, an increase of 7.7% in the budget has been observed. And for 2021, the predictions tell us that it will be an increase of 10.7%. This is the highest that we have ever seen during past years. Specifically looking at biological medicines, biologicals contribute approximately to 30% of our pharmaceutical expenses in Belgium. If we compare Belgium on biological sales per capita with our neighboring countries such as France, the UK, or Germany, we see that Belgium is more on the higher end in terms of biological sales. What can we do in order to generate competition into this market and to generate more savings and to lower prices to generate less costly systems for biological medicines? Therefore, competition in the off-patent market is required. And what do we need for competition in the off-patent biologicals market? Therefore, biosimilars are required. Biosimilars are similar versions of already authorized biological products. They have several important characteristics. First of all, they have the same clinical outcomes than their reference products. They have lower research and development costs, and therefore they come at a lower list price into the market and generate competition into the market, and that is what we need. This competitive market, as we could have created for off-patent biologicals, create several important benefits. First of all, there is the access or more access to innovative medicines. There is the fact that there are lower costs for biological therapies, and there is the fact that more patients can be treated with existing biological therapies because of a more favorable cost-effectiveness profile. But what can we do in order to evaluate whether a market is indeed competitive or not? Therefore, it is not sufficient to look at biosimilars or whether or not biosimilar market shares have been high in our country. We have to look at best value biologicals. We really prefer this term because of the fact that this takes the broader picture into account, and it looks specifically at whether or not the main advantages of a more competitive system have been fulfilled or not. And this is something that we did in Belgium in our specific case study here. We took interviews with Belgian stakeholders, and we analyzed market data obtained by RIZIV INAMI between 2013 and 2019. This all with the purpose of understanding our Belgian market in a better way. Three main observations came out of our case study. First of all, there is the fact that we see therapeutic shifts happening from off-patent alternatives towards newer medicines. Second, there is the fact that list prices mainly decrease because of mandatory price reductions. There's not really a case of spontaneous price erosion in Belgium. And lastly, there is the fact that the market is being dominated mainly by originator products. When specifically looking at those therapeutic shifts. In the hospital setting, we see a shift happening from intravenously administered products in oncology towards subcutaneously administered products. In ambulatory care setting, we see, for example, insulin less concentrated formulations towards more concentrated formulations. And also for subcutaneously administered TNF-alpha inhibitors, we see a shift occurring towards JAK or interleukin inhibitors, depending on the specific indication. But if you want to know what are really the reasons behind this? In fact, hospital products have the main reason of the hospital financing system. We know that the hospital financing system is very much relying on sales or revenues created by pharmaceuticals. Therefore, if list prices are lower or are higher for those new alternatives, in fact, it's simply more interesting for hospitals to go for that product in tender decisions. Next, in the ambulatory care setting, this still remains quite of a question mark, because therefore we have to understand in a better way the prescribing decisions of our Belgian physicians. And this is something that we really don't know yet. We think that the marketing strategies by pharmaceutical companies are quite important, and also the innovator climate is important in Belgium. But the problem or the question remains, why are such shifts really a problem? First of all, from an industry perspective, there is the fact that if the off-patent market becomes smaller due to shifts towards newer alternatives, it becomes less sustainable and less interesting to come to the Belgian market. Second, the fact that newer alternatives are a lot higher priced, it creates the fact that savings generated in the off-patent segment are being offset to a larger extent when a shift is happening. To illustrate this, we're going to look at the case of TNF-alpha inhibitors shifting towards JAK inhibitors. We see that subcutaneously administered off-patent TNF-alpha inhibitors have seen their daily cost decreasing in the past years until today with 40%. However, if we do a shift from TNF-alpha inhibitors towards JAK inhibitors, we see a daily cost on average increase with 41%. This illustrates that by an isolated shift, the main or the larger part of the savings are being offset by this specific shift. Second, our second observation, the fact that list prices decrease mainly because of mandatory price reductions. Therefore, again, a different system in hospitals can apply in comparison to the ambulatory care setting. In hospitals, there is the fact that confidential discounts in tenders are occurring, of course. This is something that we did not see reflected in our data, because we assume, and we are quite sure, that price competition is mainly occurring on the level of these confidential discounts. The disadvantageous system of the hospital financing system is very much important here again, because a lowering of the list prices would create a disadvantage in tendering decisions. In the ambulatory care setting, there is first of all the fact that already quite large mandatory price reductions for as well the biosimilar as the reference product limits the room for further price competition. And even within this limited room, still a particular volume of competing products is very much required in order to generate competition into this market. And this brings us, in fact, to the last observation and also the reason why we didn't observe list price competition, the fact that the market is being dominated by originator products. This is important. To wrap up, best value biological medicines contribute to a more sustainable healthcare system with some important associated benefits. However, if we really want to capture and to take this potential of best value biological medicines, a competitive and a sustainable market is very much required. And therefore, I would like to take a call to action for policymakers, because starting from 2023, a new wave of newly approved biosimilar products will enter the European market and possibly, or hopefully, also the Belgian market. It is important that we don't miss this opportunity.
When we talk about affordability in healthcare, we also need to address the budget impact of orphan medicines. It is my pleasure to welcome Khadidja Abdallah, who in her PhD research studies payment and budget impact of orphan medicines with the support of the Foundation for Scientific Research. Khadidja, please go ahead.
This crowd might seem very unfamiliar to you in this current climate. But what if I told you that amongst these people, one individual is living with a rare disease? You wouldn't have noticed them unless I pointed them out, right? Well, people living with a rare disease have been invisible in our societies for a long time, and so have been their medical needs. Their disease is described as rare, but actually the diseases are not as rare as one might think. In Europe, around 30 million people are living with rare diseases. This is comparable to the cumulative population of Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. To accommodate these medical needs of rare disease patients, the EU introduced some regulations around orphan drugs, which are drugs used for the treatment of rare diseases for about 20 years ago. And these implementation of regulations was really successful, and more orphan drugs had been developed. However, about 5% of the 7,000 identified rare diseases have a treatment today. Yet again, the impact of these treatments on healthcare budgets has been rising. Over the years, we've seen that in Belgium, the pharmaceutical expenditure relying to orphan drugs has risen, and that the share in the total pharmaceutical budget has also risen. These orphan drugs also have showed to be expensive and also sometimes unaffordable for our healthcare system. Now, to gauge the affordability of a new orphan drug, one performs a budget impact analysis. Now, what is done in a budget impact analysis? One looks at how a rare disease is treated in the current situation, so how many patients are involved for the treatment of a particular disease, and what are the costs associated to the treatment. Then one looks at what the intervention would, what kind of effect the intervention would have on this current environment. So, introducing this intervention, what kind of effects it will have on the costs of the treatment of the rare disease, and how many costs associated are to the intervention itself, and how many people are using the intervention. Now, the cost difference of the new environment and the current environment is called a budget impact. Even though these last years budget impact analyses have been performed more and more, we've seen that the actual spendings going to orphan drugs are really exceeding the estimations, and sometimes they just don't match what has been estimated. We therefore thought it would be interesting to investigate how current budget impact analyses for orphan drugs are performed, and we wanted to gauge what their methodological quality was. To do our study, we reviewed some literature, so international papers, and we included about 90 studies going over the budget impact analysis of orphan drugs. To really determine the quality of these studies, we used the ISPOR Good Practice Guidelines. In these guidelines, certain parameters that are paramount for budget impact analyses are laid out, and they also discuss to what criteria these parameters should adhere. So, in these guidelines, you can read that the perspective used in budget impact analysis should be of the third payer, that the population considered should be open, and that the time used for budget impact analysis should vary from 1 to 5 years. The results of the budget impact should also be reported periodically. Then the intervention, so the market effect of the intervention should be kind of estimated. Will the intervention replace the comparator, so the standard of use, or will it be combined with the standard of use, or just expand the current market? The costs that are considered in budget impact analysis should be the drug-associated costs, but also the condition-related costs should be considered. Discounting should not be reported, and assumptions made in the whole analysis should be regularly assessed through sensitivity analyses, and overall, the data used in the budget impact analysis may vary from literature or even experts' opinions, databases, or registries, and so on. Lastly, all the results of the budget impact analysis should be validated and reported. So in our study, we've seen that, so most budget impact analyses that had been reported only adhere to these 4 criteria, being the perspective, the time horizon, discounting, and data sources. But all the rest of the parameters were really not up to standard. So what can we say about the quality of budget impact analyses for orphan drugs specifically? We concluded that these are of substandard quality and that they vary greatly, but also are very concise. We therefore recommend that future analyses should adhere to guidelines such as ISPOR guidelines, but also national guidelines that may have been implemented. So really knowing how to perform these budget impact analyses correctly might even help with really controlling the budget that now has been overspent. One can argue that maybe for orphan drugs, gathering this information might not be that evident, but we are convinced that collaboration, both nationally but also internationally, could really help with gathering the necessary information to perform these budget impact analyses more accurately. Lastly, I'd like to refer to our paper where you can find some more technical details of our research, but feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to answer any queries.
Managed entry agreements are used to contain costs or to address clinical uncertainty while granting temporary reimbursement to novel medicines. Therefore, it is my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Francis Arickx. He is the head of pharmaceutical policy at RIZIV INAMI, and he will share his experience with managed entry agreements. Francis, we are looking forward to your presentation.
This is supposed to be a talk about access to innovative medicines, but I'm quite sure that most of you actually are well aware of how it actually works in Belgium and how this access, reimbursement, not marketing authorization, but the financing and reimbursement of innovative medicines actually work. So I've taken a little bit another angle to have a look at that subject, at that access. So we're going to be talking, or I'm going to be talking about the issues and actually about conflicts between objective, verifiable reasoning for making decisions versus the reality, which is judgment calls. I'm going to be talking about priorities versus conflicting interests. I'm going to be talking about looking for balances versus dilemmas where we are confronted, with which we are confronted the whole time. So, but still a bit basics. You know that the process for pricing and reimbursement of drugs in Belgium, but in most of the European countries, actually is a 3-step process. First one is the assessment phase, then the appraisal phase, then actually the decision phase. So health technology assessment, the assessment phase, the technical proposal, how do we translate the value of a drug, what we've seen in the HTA process and the assessment phase, into a technical proposal for which groups of patients do we want to reimburse the drug, at what price do we want to do that, where do we set the choices, where do we set the priorities. That's the second phase, the appraisal phase, and then the last phase is the decision phase. If you take everything together, the financing, the value, the health technology assessment, how do you come to an actual decision? So actually 3 aspects. You have science, you have the financing thing, and then the politics. So a first set of actually conflicting interests. Basically, for any drug and also for innovative medicines, 5 basic criteria in Belgium. Not only in Belgium, in most of the European countries or even worldwide. You start with added therapeutic value, you add price, you add positioning of the drug, where does it fit in the therapeutic arsenal that is available, the aspect of the budget impact, and then the cost efficiency. 5 basic criteria, 5 basic criteria for reasoning, for objective reasoning, but still the judgment call of a commission and the judgment call of politics and the minister in the end. That's the basic principle. And then you have the managed entry agreements, where we always see for aspects returning. In the end, the managed entry agreement or a contract might seem a little bit simple and might seem quite just a financial arrangement, but in fact you always have a component of value or outcome or performance-based judgment or performance-based reimbursement. You always have a component of a risk sharing, and you always have a component, some sort of a willingness to pay per patient. How much do we want to pay for the treatment for one individual patient? And then the aspect of the willingness to pay from a societal perspective, taking into account preferences, priorities, but also limits on budget impact, for instance. So basically, two big principles that you know very well: the classic decision process with the 5 criteria, and then the managed entry agreement. If a classic process is not sufficient or if it doesn't work really well, then you have a managed entry agreement or a contracting or what is called the confidential agreements to get access to that innovative drugs. But conflicting interests. Basically, this is the scene where what we are confronted with. You have patients and you have healthy citizens, and then you have the public and the public opinion, and then the press opinion, which obviously interferes with public opinion, or the other way around, and then political opinion, which interferes with press and with public opinion, and then you have science. And how do you match, or how do you try to align all these opinions and all these viewpoints on the same problem or on the same issue? First question that we actually, or the most important question that we probably have is, what is the willingness to pay? What are we willing to pay on a patient level or on a societal level? How much budget do we want to spend for a certain new innovative or not therapy? That's the willingness to pay. Sadly, remember the public opinion, the press opinion, the political opinion. We are very much confronted not with willingness to pay, but with a question of reluctancy to refuse rather than willingness to pay. How far, at what point are we not willing anymore to pay for a certain new innovative therapy? Other one is the dilemma between unmet medical needs and expectations. Are unmet medical needs really unmet medical needs? Or are those expectations actually from sick patients, expectations from academics, expectations for healthcare providers that cannot be met? Are we talking about unmet medical needs or about unmet expectations? Are we talking about uncertainties? And now I'm in the field of the decision makers and I'm at the seat of a decision maker. If a commission of reimbursement of drug, if the experts or the professional decision makers in a commission of reimbursement of drugs are confronted with uncertainties or are looking at uncertainties, are they really looking at scientific uncertainties? Or, because these are people in that commission of reimbursement of drugs, are they also having expectations of that new innovative therapy? And are they translating these false expectations into false uncertainties? Another dilemma, or another balance to be found. Clearly, a balance to be found is the one between cost efficiency and budget impact, and then opportunity cost. We cannot spend €1 twice. That means if we spend money for a new innovative therapy, it might be an investment in something that is not worth the while, or we might not be investing in something which is very much worth the while, and then losing opportunities for added healthcare somewhere. So cost efficiency is obviously a very important aspect of the pricing and reimbursement decision, but also budget impact, the societal preference and the societal willingness to pay is as much important. And then you have the whole discussion on the financing, and most of the time, and that is a bit of a big issue actually, and we have been confronted with that recently a lot, and now coming back on that, it's the one of the financing. It's the problem of the financing. Most of the time, if we're talking about financing, we tend to split the problem in different parts and then tackle one part. But we lose a little bit the overview or the coherence between the three different aspects. And actually, in the whole financing discussion, we should be talking about pricing, but also about budget allocation. Is our system for budget allocation actually well adapted for the challenges that the future gives us? And then about pricing or not pricing mechanisms, but purchasing mechanisms. Like, for instance, reimbursement is one of the purchasing mechanisms. Another one could be joint procurement of a drug and then just delivering it from the state. Another one could be forfeitary or lump sum reimbursement of a certain therapy. So these three aspects always come together actually, but we tend to have very large discussions on pricing and the much too high prices of drugs, and then forget a bit about the purchasing mechanisms. Or we tend to be focusing a lot on purchasing mechanisms, and I'll be coming back on that a little bit later. For instance, on how do we have a new drug and it's a one-shot therapy, it's a gene therapy or it's a cell therapy, it's a one-shot therapy, but it costs a fortune and everybody knows the examples of that. How are we going to pay for that at the long term? Forgetting a little bit the aspect of budgeting and forgetting a little bit the aspect of pricing. At that point in time, we're only talking about purchasing mechanisms. And that is something we should tackle very quickly. Find the link between pricing, budgeting, and purchasing. Find the balance between pricing, budgeting, and purchasing. Luckily, there are solutions for that. And I'll be coming back on that a little bit later. And then you have the old, I probably was asked to represent RIZIV INAMI here at this conference, to represent the payer. I'm always asked to represent the payer perspective, and I do not like that label, actually. We, the Social Security or health insurance, should not be seen and should not act as a payer. We should act as a buyer. Probably the most important shift in the mindset actually that happened in the last few years, that I have seen in the last few years, is actually the awareness of the realization of payers, of social security systems, of health insurance systems, that they do not have to act and that they are not payers anymore. They are much more buyers. They set priorities and they need to choose what they want to buy. And at what quality they want to buy the product that is offered. And the fact is actually that the pharmaceutical industry has a monopoly position where buyers, health insurance agencies, social security systems have a monopoly position. They are the sole and the unique buyers of the product that is offered by the pharmaceutical industry. And that is what I have seen happening lately or the last few years, is actually that social security systems and health insurance systems have been realizing that and have been acting a lot more like buyers, choosing, setting their preferences, setting their priorities, making choices between what to buy and what not to buy, and certainly at what quality they want to buy. And that is probably one of the reasons where we see more and more that actually buyers, are not choosing anymore for products or for a therapeutic arsenal, but are choosing for outcome, for performance and for outcome and for value. And the idea of the countries, states, nations, health insurance systems, social security systems actually acting as buyers has taken different forms, and different solutions, different international solutions have been searched. And here I'm not going to be talking about the Benelux collaboration, you know about that. There's other collaborations that are very similar and actually start to act very similar to the Benelux collaboration as real buyers, uniting themselves, trying to come up with a joint willingness to pay, with an idea of new systems for budget allocation, with actually political statements on preferences and on, have a look at the website of Benelux. You will find some statements on how we see value, how different nations, how different systems see value. Look at very soon there will be a publication or there will be something on a joint statement from the Benelux collaboration and the Nordic collaboration also on where we want to go to, you see that social security systems and health systems are acting as buyers. One of the things that we will need very much to be able to actually perform as very well educated or very well documented buyer is actually to see what is in the market, what is coming to the market. And for that, Benelux developed a horizon scan system. Now it's well established and it's an international system. And have a look at that website. It's IC.org, the International Horizon Scan Initiative. This is one of the tools that buyers, social security systems, health insurance systems, and nations or countries are going to be using in the future to take up their role and in a responsible way as a buyer of or as an investor in health and health outcome for its population. Why? Not only for budget allocation, but also to start a dialogue with the patients and with the public and with the politics and with healthy citizens on where should we set, let's have a look at what is coming, where should we set our priorities, where should we allocate the budgets that we have available. And then you have, apart from that, apart from the pricing discussion and the budgeting discussion and the preferences discussion, you have the whole discussion on what mechanisms should we use to actually pay for all that. And there's a lot of solutions. There's and there were a few examples of studies that have been made in Belgium with the Arickx School and with the KU amongst others, but also at the London School of Economics, where we have looked at possible new solutions, innovative solutions, to pay at the long term. And you all know about the outcome-based reimbursement systems. But also, can we have spread payments, for instance? Should we reinsure our own health insurance? And examples are that here in the Arickx study, but not only in Belgium, also London School of Economics did a very similar study on that. Innovative payment models, so the purchasing model, the third aspect of the whole financing mechanisms, and came actually up. That's a good sign and also a bad sign. They came up with, or the London School of Economics came up with the same list or a very similar list of possible solutions for new and innovative funding mechanisms for innovative medicines.
I would like to thank the speakers, and also a big thank you to the audience who have submitted a number of questions, which we will discuss now. And we will now switch to the live stream of the speakers. Good afternoon. We have just heard 3 very insightful presentations addressing the topic of affordability in healthcare, also within the Belgian context. We now move on to the live Q&A session, and this session is also being recorded. Thank you for forwarding your questions through the chat, and I will put some of these questions to our external speaker, Dr. Arickx, and our 2 PhD researchers. Maybe let's start with Dr. Arickx. We had a question looking at the prices of innovative medicines, and if through the life cycle of an innovative medicine, the added value actually turns out to be bigger than initially thought, is there a possibility to increase the price of such an innovative medicine?
There's a double answer to that. The technical answer to your question is no, the price cannot go up because it's a maximum. The real price, the technical price, list price of a drug cannot go up as long as the Minister of Economic Affairs does not decide that the price rise can be granted. On the other hand, and that is probably the content of your question, is it possible that society or the health insurance is going to pay more for the same drug? That means, is it possible that the confidential refund that is arranged through a contract diminishes or gets lower when additional evidence is gathered or provided with? And yes, that is possible. It is possible. And one of the examples is, for instance, if after a contract there is decided that the managed entry agreement is no longer necessary, and that the drug can be listed definitely in the list of reimbursable drugs at the list price or at a reduced price. It can be higher than what was paid during the managed entry agreement, or the managed entry agreement is repeated or prolonged with a higher cost for society. Same price, but a lower refund and a higher cost for society. That is possible.
Okay, I think that's a very clear answer. So there is some scope to renegotiate prices within the context of following a managed entry agreement. I would like to move on to Yannick. In your presentation, you highlighted the fact that originator products have a dominant position in Belgium. So how would you ensure that in the long term, we have multiple suppliers available in the Belgian market?
Yes, thank you very much, Steven, for this question. I believe this question is in theory more related to the fact whether or not a competitive or a sustainable market is indeed happening in Belgium. So if a competitive and a sustainable market is available in Belgium, then multiple suppliers will be interested in our market as well. So I believe that it should be part of the bigger approach, looking at how increasing sustainability and competitiveness of our market. And I believe several aspects are indeed important for such an approach. And I would like to emphasize especially that a proactive as well as a complete approach is very important in our Belgian policy system. So looking at, for example, information and education, especially for patients, but also for healthcare workers coming into contact with biological therapies. I'm looking at tendering systems that should be optimized. The hospital financing system is, of course, very much important within this particular market. But I know, of course, that it is part of a much larger approach, but it should be included here. I'm looking at gain sharing, possibly accompanied by a quota or target arrangement for biosimilars, especially in the ambulatory care. And lastly, I believe it's important that we have to look at the market, not completely, but specifically looking at the different therapeutic groups that are important in the off-patent biologicals market. So the approach should be tailored to each specific part or each specific therapeutic group within this market. And lastly, I think it's important, specifically looking at more the proactive approach, that we have to look at how does the market change after biosimilars come into the market, or after off-patent or after those products become off-patent biologicals. So really as a stimulus for rational drug usage, like for example, looking into the revision of the reimbursement guidelines, as well as looking into how can we stimulate rational drug prescription for physicians.
Okay, thank you. I would like to go back to Francis because we got a related question to supply diversity. The question relates to the example of monopsony and the collaborations with other countries such as within Benelux. Does this type of initiative also consider the need for maintaining healthy competition, ensuring future development either of patent products or new molecular entities, and guarantee supply diversity? So the question is about the impact of Benelux or similar initiatives on supply diversity in the market in the long run.
Benelux is part of the policy mix. So obviously, it is completely logical that each country who's facing exactly the same issues of diversity, of competition, and so on, will keep that in the back of its head when discussing policies, when negotiating, or when doing HTAs, or when negotiating new innovative therapies. So yes, it does, but not explicitly. If the question is, do we discuss that immediately? Yes, we discuss biosimilar policy, for instance, or generic competition. In terms of policy development, in terms of exchange of good practices, but it is not focusing in the first place, but Benelux collaboration is not focusing in the first place on these topics. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you for that. Let's move on to Khadidja. You spoke about these ISPOR guidelines about the methodology of budget impact analysis, but we sometimes see that in a dossier for reimbursement submitted to the RIZIV INAMI, the budget impact analysis does not perfectly adhere to these guidelines. Why is that the case, in your opinion?
So in particular for orphan drugs, there might be some data missing that is actually required to really have this perfect methodology in a budget impact. But also we have to remember that these guidelines are quite new, and it takes a while to implement these guidelines in practice. So I think they date from 2012. And just getting everyone on board can take like a while. And specifically for orphan drugs, so that data, the lack of data that is necessary, let's say because there's like the small population, it's not always easy to get all of it together.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I would like to close off with one final question to Francis. It's not really related to the topic of affordability, but never mind. It's about vaccine pricing and reimbursement. And the question is whether vaccines follow the same process, the same review process as any other medicine, and whether the COVID vaccines in particular followed a general process or whether it was more an ad hoc process.
Yes, the vaccines follow exactly the same process for each, so the same process of assessment, appraisal, decision, except for the COVID vaccines. There was no assessment. Well, there was an assessment, I suppose, but done by EMA, so not really a value assessment. And we all know that this is really a rolling assessment and more on efficacy and on safety than on value. That's one. And the purchasing mechanism was completely different. The purchasing mechanism was completely different through centralized purchasing of that drug through Europe, where Belgium was represented, but centralized purchasing. We did not see. Very typical as the rolling assessment. You all know that on the thresholds for age. Due lack of evidence on the one hand, and on the other hand, safety issues or possible safety issues or presumed safety issues. We see changes in recommendations, well, every week, more or less, for the different vaccines that are available. That is because of evidence or knowledge or expertise becoming available on the real life use of these products.
Absolutely, it's really a roll-on experience where we generate and assess new evidence on a continuous basis and adapt our strategy and guidelines accordingly.
Mainly on an evidence on efficacy and on I'm not talking about value, but mainly evidence on efficacy and on safety.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, I would like to thank our speakers for their contribution of today. I would also like to thank or express our gratitude to the Minister of Health and Social Affairs, Frank van den Broeke, to all our external speakers and our PhD researchers who provided their insights during the 4 webinars or the 4 sessions of our webinar series. I hope you enjoyed our sessions, that you took some messages home. And I would also like to thank the research results that were shared by our colleagues. As you know, within our unit, we carry out research on numerous topics which are all related to improving decision-making in healthcare. So if you want to take contact with us and have any queries, please feel free to contact either Professor Isabel Heus or myself. And I think this now concludes our webinar. I would like to thank you all and wish you a very nice day. Thank you and goodbye.